I am Joe Linehan, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is October the 7th, 1972. My home group is the Simply AA group in Edmond, Oklahoma. Gosh, it's great. What a place. This is an international lineup. You know, Al called me, and thanks, Al, for inviting me. And I looked at the speakers they'd invited and everything. And in Oklahoma, you know, we have slang. We have our Oklahoma stuff that we carry on with. And I looked at that lineup, and I thought, man, I'm going to feel like a bastard calf at a roundup, you know. Yeah. I so much enjoyed Larry last night. You know, I believe that if Larry was in your home group and you walked in there and he told you to sit down and shut up, you'd listen. Yeah. We need those guys, that's for sure. Bob's been a great host, and his wife, Debbie, their son, Rice. Gosh, neat family, neat people. I've met Doc, you know. When you're my age, you want a doc pretty close, and so I got him up front here in case something I fall out or something. So, hey, well, I'm supposed to tell in a general way, you know, what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like today, and I'm going to try to do that to the best of my ability. I'm supposed to be proud of my heritage, but I'm not sure that I am. I'm an Irish Indian, and there ought to be a law against that, I'll tell you. Two things. We like to fight, and we like to drink, and we're not good at either one. I heard a guy from California gets around a lot, and he said his fighting record is 133-3. He lost 133, and 3 times they almost killed him, and that's kind of my record. You know, I've hooked into everybody that shared this weekend, and you know, so many things, and my mind was racing this morning, and I was thinking. Clancy talking about sponsorship last night, and the fact that if he hadn't had Bob when he had him, and if he hadn't had Chuck when he had him, you know, the two just wouldn't have mixed. And my experience has been much the same. I started out my drinking career, as the book calls it, and it was, thank God, a pretty short drinking career. I'm not as tough as some of you, you know. I hear these guys all the time, you know, I drank a quart of whiskey a day for 30 years and all that, and, you know, I couldn't stay hooked. I had my first drink when I was 15 years old, and I walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous the first time, May 1968, at 23 years old, and for the next 4 years, I was in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous, and mainly more out than in, and it was a troubling time. 12 years from my first drink to when I walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous for the last time, I hope. But like so many other folks, early on, you know, I was telling somebody this weekend of how my life changed, and I really can't put my finger on exactly what happened. But somewhere around 4 years old, I can remember being in the basement of the First Christian Church there in my hometown, and I was 4 years old and singing "Jesus Loves Me," and I was as full of the Spirit as any human being could be. I was absolutely free. I wasn't aware that my ears were bigger than everybody else in the room. I wasn't aware that my mother had painted my shoes. Any of you ever have to do that? We only had one pair of shoes, and we wore them all the time. I mean, you know, and on Sunday morning, my mother had this black stuff, and she painted these shoes, and that was the stinkingest stuff in the world. But you know, at that time, it didn't matter. I wasn't watching of how much different, or I wasn't observing how much different I was than the rest of the folks in the room. And great time, you know, and by the time I'm 6 years old, I can remember being on the playground at the elementary school across the street from my home, and there was a pickup truck backed up to our house. And someone said, "Joe, what's going on down at your house?" And I said, "Oh, they're bringing us a new TV." Well, we didn't own a TV, you know, but I just let him know, you know, I started lying, and I started becoming, thinking I wasn't enough, and so I had to lie and deceive people to think that I was something that I wasn't. And pretty much that's the way my life unfolded. By the time I'm 15 years old, the perception I had of myself that I was little, ugly, dumb, and poor. Now, I was explaining that to a friend of mine. He says, "What do you do in Alcoholics Anonymous?" I said, "Well, we just kind of tell the truth about our lives." I said, "I always start out my deal with us little, ugly, dumb, and poor." And he said, "Man, you was dead on." You know. So, anyway, I had my first drink, and some older guys took me out, and we drank some beer, and I thought it was a joke. That was the nastiest tasting stuff I'd ever had in my mouth, and they're laughing and giggling and what have you, and they said, "What do you think?" And I want to be a part so bad. I said, "Oh, this is fun. This is great. I really like this." And the truth of it, I was letting a good part of it run down my face to keep from having to swallow it. And I didn't drink much, and Clancy described it last night and always does a great job of describing that. As that stuff went to my stomach and it ran to my fingertips and my toes, and I've always described it as best I remember it as a warm, tingling glow. And if I think about that a little bit, it seems like that was only 4 or 5 years ago, some 40 years ago. So that was my first experience with alcohol. I mean, I was a little kid. I was a follower, always ran around with older, bigger guys, and just kind of a tag-along. And that night, after drinking some of that terrible stuff, I went from the back of the pack to the front. And I loved it. And they took me to a little service station there. When you drink beer, you got to get rid of it. They took me to a service station, and I remember going in the bathroom and getting rid of some of that beer, and I turned around, and there was a full-length mirror on the wall. And as I looked at that mirror, for the first time, I loved everything I saw in that mirror. Those great big old ears, you know, just seemed to kind of pull back, and that hair just kind of laid down, and those zits kind of shrunk down, you know. I even kind of gave it one of those deals and pulled that deal up, you know. I weighed about 110 pounds, you know, pretty impressive, you know. Did y'all ever ride around with your window rolled down and smash your arm on the windowsill to make your arm look bigger? Yeah, right on. My arms are about that big around, look like a piece of spaghetti hanging out there, you know. I'd give you that bad guy look, though, you know. And you know, alcohol from that night, you know, my first night became more and more important to me. I don't know that I was alcoholic. I did get drunk that night. I did absurd things. I was always just infatuated with the women, but I was scared to death of them. And that night, after drinking very little, those guys took me downtown and just turned me loose like a monkey, you know, and I ran down the streets, and 15 years of lust came out. I mean, I've been thinking about it a long time, and I thought this is the time to get this all out, you know. I told those girls what was on my mind and what had been on my mind for a long time, and I didn't spare nothing, you know. And I tried to get in a fight with Leroy. Leroy was a football player, about 6'5", you know, 275 pounds. And I woke up the next morning. Well, actually, I had a tremendous night. I laid down in my bed, and I'd been sleeping in that bed a long time, but it did something extremely strange that night. It just kind of went around like that. Wow, you know, what was that all about, you know? Kind of got settled down a little bit, and it did it again. And then it didn't stop, and it picked up speed, and it was getting momentum, you know. it was spinning so hard I hung my foot off the ground and tried to slow it down by dragging my foot, you know. And I mean, I lost it right there, and got up the next morning. I don't think I've ever been any sicker in my life. And when I see the man in the bed, I always think about myself, because I spent so many mornings on the side of that bed. And that particular morning, I got up, and man, my heart was beating. Every time my heart would beat, my head would almost explode. I thought I had about 110 temperature. I was bad shape, but I had this thought. I said, you know, I've got to get to the pool hall and thank those guys for that wonderful night I had last night. You know, there's something wrong with that thinking. You know, like I said, I don't know that I was an alcoholic that time. I did seem to be able to kind of somewhat moderate at different times. But by the time I was 18 years old, I was drinking almost on a daily basis, and what little control I ever had was gone. All my buddies were getting married, and you know, I got a little girlfriend, and we got to dating a little bit, and all my buddies were getting married, and so we decided we'd get married, and we were going to get married in December. We had to step that up a little bit. She got pregnant, and we got married in September, and that wedding was something to behold. I think my mother, my dad, the minister, and the bride was the only sober person in that church. And as we started this ceremony, her daddy was about 5 foot and weighed about 2.5. And he had a good load on, and the minister says, "Who gives this woman away?" And he says, "Her mother does." Well, bring her up here, you know. They took my wedding pictures. My best man was having to hold me up. And it was, bless her heart, she married me to get out of an alcoholic home. And we had a baby, a little girl, a short time later. This little girl was premature. She was about 6 weeks premature, and she weighed just over 2 pounds. And nowadays, that's not so much of a problem, but then it was a big problem. And the little girl lived 18 hours. And I stood there and I watched her take every breath that she took on this earth. And I never felt so helpless in my entire life. I wanted to help her. Her little old chest would just contract and expand, and her skin looked like it was just paper thin. And I was a guy that came to Alcoholics Anonymous and didn't believe that selfishness and self-centeredness was my problem. But I want to tell you that it wasn't. From the time that little girl was born until I got in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I never gave a thought of how that little girl's life or death affected anybody on this earth but me. And sadly, I used that excuse of losing that little girl as another excuse for my drinking. This girl and I had a typical alcoholic marriage, I think, or at least what my marriage is. I've had several, and there's 4 years we'd bust up and we'd go back together, then we'd bust up and she'd move home with her mother and dad, and then we'd get to seeing each other, and then I'd move in with mom and dad, you know, and then I'd get in trouble again and move out. She'd get an attorney before we get the papers all done, you know, we'd go back together. And finally, after 4 years, we were able to get a divorce, and that came at a great time because my girlfriend was pregnant. And, you know, I married her. I'll never forget that I wanted to wait. In Oklahoma, you've got to be divorced 6 months before you can get remarried, and so I'm right down to the wire, and she's getting bigger by the day, and we couldn't find anybody to marry us. And this girl's over 8 months pregnant, and we finally walk into a little church in Minco, Oklahoma. And this little minister comes out, a little young guy, and he says, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "I need to get married." And he looked over at her and he said, "You sure do." you know, quick. And so we got married and had the little boy, and I didn't like the responsibility of being the breadwinner and interfered with my activities and my drinking and what have you. So I wanted out, and before I could get out, she got pregnant again, and I said, I'm done now. So I get a divorce, and that came at an outstanding time because my girlfriend was pregnant, and I can shorten this up considerably. I had 3 sons in 10 months and 2 days, and I had 4 in a total of 30 months. Now, that doesn't make me alcoholic, but Jerry Springer would like to hear that story, I feel sure. I found out that alcohol is not the only thing I'm powerless over, I'll tell you for sure. What would a guy tell? Why would a guy get up in public and tell that? That's amazing. I had some difficulties. I love these kids come in and whine about their DUIs and this, that, and the other, because I went from little assault and battery charges and public drunk and that type of thing to the big stuff. And I stole a person once, and I beat this guy up, and I put him in the trunk of my car. And it's one of those nights where I'm blacked out, and I'm kind of conscious, and I'm blacked out, and I think I really kind of forgot about him, And for some reason, I took him over to my brother-in-law's house about 2 in the morning, and I got the whole family up, the little kids, and you need to come out here and see what I got. And they all file out there. It's 26th day of December, and they all walk out there, and I open the trunk on this car, and this little guy looks out, It scared my sister, so I slammed the deck lid back down. And I let him go, and we're all laughing, carried on. She got in trouble last night. We laughed about it all night long, how funny that was and what have you, and see him running down the street in his shorts and me hollering at him. And anyway, the next day the police came and picked me up and arrested me on a charge of kidnapping. And, through the grace of God and a great attorney, I was able to get out of that deal with a 3-year suspended sentence, and so I was trying to do that time and trying to stay out of trouble, and it was just an impossibility. And I'd done about a year and a half of that 3 years, and I got busted on a first-degree rape charge. And they put me in Oklahoma County Jail, and the sad thing about it was I had no idea whether I was guilty or not. To this day, I had no idea. And the attorney said if we just set this thing out, eventually it'd go away. And so I was in the jail there, and the visitation day at the county jail is on Tuesdays. And everybody looks forward to Tuesday, and I wasn't any different than the rest of them. And I remember looking out the little peephole in the jail there, and I could see my little mother. And I thought, I knew she'd be here. She was always there for me and continued to support me. And right behind her was my wife. And I thought, man, on the surface, I'm surprised she's here, but I'm glad she's here, And I looked over kind of behind her, and was another wife. I thought, well, that's probably not real good. And way over to the right, I could see my girlfriend. And her husband was standing behind her. My mother wades through this mass of people and stands on her tiptoes, and she screams into this little box, "Honey, I know there's been a terrible mistake, and I'll have you out there as soon as possible." And my response was, "Not today, Mom. This is the safest place for me right here." I was a guy that had a lot of success early on, and I was an automobile salesman, and I can remember being in the city jail. I was 21 years old, and I didn't look like everybody else in that jail. There were some pitiful looking people in that jail. This was a transition time, and they were redoing the jail, and so they just took an old warehouse and made a jail out of it. It was just wire cages, and in order to make the plumbing work, they built a platform, and they had the stools and urinals and what have you up on that platform. And I remember watching this old man walk across that nasty concrete floor and through all that nasty stuff that was on the floor, barefooted. And he stepped up there and he stuck his foot down in the toilet stool and washed it off. And I thought, that must be one of those alcoholics. That's awful. I wouldn't even sit down in their jail. And in 6 short years from that time, I was the guy in that jail washing my face off. Alcohol gathered me up in a big hurry. When like I said, in May 1968, I walked into the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous for the first time, and there was 4 terribly old men there, and they were a glum lot. There was AC, SD, WD, and Mac, and they were old, 40, some. And they kind of talked in tongues. They had some of the weirdest stuff, and they just talked so strange. And one of them in particular was just a complete and total jackass, I'm telling you. And he, but over a period of 4 years, as I came and went, those 4 guys seemed like they just sat there and waited on me. I had anybody here ever live in a car other than Clancy? We're a special breed, I think car dwellers are just special people. I've always wanted to have a conference just for car dwellers. I thought, I've got it planned. We'll just go rent a salvage yard, and give me $5 and go pick your house, and you can get pretty creative when you live in a car. And I had a 60 model Ford Falcon, and it was a nice car and perfect for me. It had a hole right under the driver's seat that was about that big around this. The front of the seat actually it wasn't connected. It just kind of hung out over the highway. And it was baby blue, and it had blue vinyl seats. And it was perfect for me. I could just walk out of the beer joint, get into that old car, pass out, wet my pants, and it just run right out on the road. It's self-cleaning, And I remember I'd come across a lot of money, $5 I think it was, and I decided I'd go driving. And normally I just parked this little car behind the beer joint, and that's where I hung out. I had no place to go. So that particular night I went out and I was driving the Falcon, and as I was driving around, I dropped a cigarette between my legs, and no need to stop, but I do need to find that cigarette, and I'm looking for it, and I'd look up every once in a while, and I couldn't find it. And in Oklahoma, we have what we call bar ditches. The roads are all run off like this, and they're dirt roads. About the third time I looked up, I'm in the bar ditch, and just going like heck, and I thought, well, that's no problem. There's less traffic here in the bar ditch, I'm still trying to find that cigarette, and in the meantime, I hit a culvert going into somebody's driveway, and this car starts flipping and turning over, and it was awful, and it went all the way across the street and landed upside down right next to a guy's porch. Now, you hear of the keen alcoholic mind. Now, you only hear that in AA. It's the only place. But I had my moment of clarity. When this thing stopped what it was doing, I'm sitting on the headliner. And it just, as clear as a bell, I thought, I'm upside down, so I've got to roll the window up to get out. So I roll the window up and get out. It was kind of like this porch. I mean, this car was right next to this porch, and the wheels are still turning. There's smoke in the tire. The wreck didn't really bother me. It was all that debris flying around inside that car. I had about 7 spares. And when I came out of there was a guy standing on this porch about the size of Larry. And I look up at him, and he looks down at me, and he says, "Are you having trouble?" Oh, I mean, it's amazing what people say to us and do to us, But I got 2 problems now. I don't have a transportation or a home, and I actually went to the wrecker yard where this car was towed in and asked the guy if I could live in that car in his junkyard. He just looked at me like, what in the world, I said, "Man, I'll help watch after the place. I just need a place to live." And he said, no, he couldn't do that. And so I moved into a vacant house. And by this time, I had a brown paper bag full of a few dirty clothes. And my prized possession, my most cherished possession at that time, was a U-Haul quilt that I'd got out of a U-Haul truck. And that's all I owned. And I moved into this vacant house, and I'd set up housekeeping there, no electricity, no running water, no nothing. And my brother-in-law came by to see me one day and visit with me, and he said, "Joe, would you consider going back to Alcoholics Anonymous?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't think that deal will work for me." And he said, "If you'll consider going back, I'll try to find you a place to live." So I said, okay, and he came back in a little while, and he said his mother's name was Pauline, and I'd known her most of my life. Thought she was a nice lady. But he said, Pauline said you could live with her as long as you're sober and you're going to Alcoholics Anonymous. So I moved in with Pauline, and immediately I think, I'll lay around and watch a little TV. Pauline will wash my clothes up and feed me good, and everything will be fine. And she did all that. We had a nice meal, and she washed my clothes and got me up the next morning. She said, "Joe, you need a job." And I said, "A job?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, I said, "Well, I'd love to have a job, but I don't have a driver's license. I don't have a car. If I did have a license, and who would hire me anyway?" She said, "Well, you go to the apartment complex over there and see a guy named Jay and see if he doesn't need some help." So I go over to the apartments, and I find Jay, and he takes me into his office for this interview, and he said, "Joe," he said, "do you know how to paint?" And I said, "No, I'm not very good at painting." And he said, "Well," he said, "could you clean an apartment so somebody could live in it?" And I said, "I'm not very good at cleaning at all." And he said, "Well, can you mow yards and that kind of stuff?" And I said, "No, I can't get those things started. I'm just not very good at that at all. He says, I believe you're the man I'm looking for. So I'm going to AA and mowing yards and painting and carrying on, and I met another woman, and imagine that. Jay kind of liked me, and he said, hey, the assistant manager here is a single gal. I'd like for you to meet her. And I said, well, she said, well, he said she's recuperating from some surgery, but she'll be in a day or two, and, I'll introduce you. So, I don't know, about a week passed, and he called me in the office, and this very attractive blonde lady was there, and got to visiting with her, and I'm going to AA, and I'm hearing all this stuff down there. And so I get to visiting with this lady, and I said, well, where have you been? And she said, well, I've had some surgery. And I said, well, what kind of surgery? She said, well, just some surgery. And I said, well, you know how we are. I said, well, what kind of surgery? I mean, there's lots of surgeries. And she said, well, I just had a hysterectomy. I knew right there that's God's will for me. So she invited me down for lunch or dinner one night, and I went down for dinner, and I never would leave. And everything went well. Things went really well, and I'm going to AA, and I'd come home and I'd tell her about what I'd discovered about myself and about God and what have you. And we really had some meaningful conversations. And one morning I went to work, and I thought, I've heard those guys talk about social drinking. I believe I can do some of that. Now, I was a little bit awkward at it. I'd never done any before, but I thought I could do it. Besides, they told me down here at AA that God was all powerful, and if He was that powerful, surely He could help me moderate. So, like I said, I was kind of awkward at this social drinking, so I went to a Redbud store about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I drank a can of beer, and I went back to work. And I thought, well, I got it. So Tuesday I had a couple. Wednesday I had several. And Thursday I was drunk. This was the spring of 1972. And of course that relationship was over immediately, because when I drink, everything else goes. And I ended up just kind of bumming around, lost a job, took a construction job way down in the southern part of the state. Not because I needed to work, I needed a place to stay, and they kind of provided a place to stay. And I was drunk at a club in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and somehow or another someone got a word to me that this gal's favorite uncle had passed away. And so I told everybody the entire evening, I'm going to take her to that funeral. I just need to do that. She needs my support. And so somehow or another I got from the southern part of the state back to Edmond. And the next morning I walked into her home to take her to a funeral. This was October the 7th of 1972. I walked into her house to take her to a funeral in a pair of cut-off Levi's, a T-shirt, and I hadn't shaved or bathed in 2 or 3 days. Walked right in there like I had a suit on. And I'll never forget, as I approached her, she looked up from a chair she was sitting in. And I want to describe the look. And if you're alcoholic and if you got any family at all, you've seen that look. There's every emotion known to man in that stare. There's disgust, there's pity, there's everything in that look. I'd seen that from my mother. I'd seen that from my 2 sisters. I'd seen that from grandmothers. I'd seen it from lots of people. But that particular morning, that stare penetrated and went to a point inside of me that I didn't know existed. It was obvious she wasn't going to go anywhere with me. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. And then I turned and I walked out of her house. I had one of the most terrifying thoughts, at that point, most terrifying thoughts of my life. And the thought was, today's the day for you to stop drinking. And that took me to a depth of fear. I'd had that thought before, but not ever at that depth. The very next thought I had took me into a totally another dimension of fear. I knew for the very first time in my 27 years there was absolutely no way in the world that I could stop drinking. And I knew that. Now, when Bill talks about how dark it is before the dawn, I believe that's the time that I experienced that. Because I'm in a catch-22. I can't drink, and I can't keep from drinking. And I went to a friend of mine's apartment, and fortunately he was gone, so I just moved in, and I started through what I hope to be my last sobering up process. And what happened was that was a Friday, and I stayed all day Friday night, Saturday night in that apartment. And I'd had DTs before, and I was fearful of that. But I got to thinking about the 4 years that I'd been in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous, and those 4 old men who seemed to have absolutely nothing going in their life. And what I could remember what was said, who said it, and it all began to kind of take shape. And what had happened was they had predicted 4 years in advance what was going to happen to me, and all those things had become a truth. Now, they did that by sharing their own experience. And I knew for the first time that they truly knew something that I didn't know. I got to feeling a little better Sunday, and that mind kicked back in, and I thought, I bet you if I offered to take her to the movie, I could probably get back in. I hate movies. I've never cared anything in the world about movies. I've never been around a woman in my entire life that wasn't a movie freak. And she was no exception. So I called her about noon Sunday, and I said, hey, how'd you like to go to the movie today? She said, well, I'd love that. I said, well, come get me and I'll take you. So she'd already had a movie picked out, and we went to downtown Oklahoma City to an old theater on Will Rogers Theater on Western, and we went in there and sat down. And this movie was kind of like your first AA meeting. It was probably something like 36 hours long, you know. And we got in, get sat down. The movie starts, and about halfway through this movie, I start sweating, and sweat's running off of me, across my face, off my hair, under my arms, to my waist. It was running off the palms of my hands. And I knew what was getting ready to happen, and I started getting cold. And I was trying to hold myself in this chair. And this was an old theater, and it was an old bolt-together type seats, and I'm sitting back there, and I'm hanging on, you know, and this chair's squeaking and rattling and banging, and people in the theater are turning around and looking, you know. I'm cool even in DTs. I start looking around. And everybody, I'm on the last row. Everybody knows where it's coming from, you know, and my God, I didn't know how much longer I could hang on. And finally the movie was over, and we ran out into the foyer. And who did we run into in the foyer of that theater was an old man that had 12-stepped me on no less than 4 times. Ran smack dab into him and his wife. And of all the theaters in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, you know, why that one and that afternoon. He said, Joe, how you doing? And what did I say? Fine. Do you know I look good? He said, well, what'd you do about your drinking? And I said, well, I quit. He said, really? when? I said, Friday. He and his wife took me and this lady that they'd never met to their home and sat with me. They used to mix up all kinds of stuff. You'll either sober up or you'll die of food poisoning. And they shook it, honey and orange juice and I don't know what all they put in it. And I'd try to swallow it and I was sick. And Dorothy took Shirley in the other room and talked to her. And Bill just sat with me and nursed me way into the night. The very next night, Bill came to pick me up and took me to my first AA meeting at the Classing Club in Oklahoma City. And I'll never forget a lady that chaired that meeting, and her name was Inell, a great, great woman. And about 2 minutes till 9, she turned around, and I'm sitting kind of back to back on this, kind of out of the light. And she said, "How about you? You got anything to say?" And I have no idea where this came from, but I said, "I'm Joe, and I'm an alcoholic, and I got no place else to go. I'm here because I don't have any place else to go." I didn't know how truthful I was. Well, Wednesday night rolled around, and we went to the Edmond group, and there that guy Al was, the doc, the guy that was so rude to me. And I just couldn't hardly stand to hear him, in the meetings, and everybody paid attention when he talked. And, we started going to meetings all over the central part of Oklahoma there. And I wasn't sober very long, and I went to our regular Wednesday night home group meeting. And after the meeting, I walked up to this old guy that I didn't like, and I said, "Hey, Doc," I said, you really think I'm alcoholic?" He said, "Joe, here at Alcoholics Anonymous, we allow every individual the dignity to figure that out for themselves. So I'm going to make an exception with you." "We're going to call you alcoholic till we figure out what is wrong with you." And after that, and where this came from, and I think it's Clancy talked about it last night, and just brought back so many memories. I asked that man what may have been the changing thing in my entire life. As I asked that man, I said, "Would you sponsor me?" And he said, "You come down to the office and we'll talk about that." And he had a little clinic in downtown Edmond. And I went down there and I started going down there on a daily basis. I was unemployable, so I had plenty of time, and I went down there every day. And I wasn't doing that very long, and this guy figured out something about me that very few people on this planet knew. And we were back in his office, and he turned around and he looked me right in the eye, and he said, "Joe, you can't read, can you?" Now, everything inside of me says, tell one more lie. Work out of this thing. For some reason I didn't. I said, "No, Doc, I can't." And he said, "Well, boy, we're going to have to learn to read." And he said that with such conviction that right there I kind of got the idea, well, maybe I could. That's 27 years old. So he got some Popular Mechanics and Field and Stream magazine and the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, and we started having reading lessons every day. And I was kind of picking it up, kind of getting there a little bit. And I remember he asked me, he said, "At the speaker meeting this month, I want you to read How It Works." I said, "Okay." And I sat, as I looked out there, and I could see him sitting there. He was as proud as any father could be. And I read How It Works. Now, the speaker only had to make a 20-minute talk that night. But we got her done, you know what I mean? But what a powerful, powerful thing to have a guy. This guy had 4 children. He had a profession. He had a wife. He was on the city council. He was a busy, busy guy. But not once did he say, "Hey, I don't have time for you." Not once. Amazing, amazing thing. He's an intimidating guy. Very intimidating guy. And he, we started having meetings right there in his clinic, and he spoon-fed me the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Brought it very, very simple because I was a very, very simple guy. And he brought it down to me as Joe. He said, "I need to ask you a couple of questions that you need to ask yourself." He says, "What happens to you when you drink?" I said, "Well, I get drunk." He said, "What happens when you try to quit?" I said, "I get drunk." You know. So he broke the first step down. He goes, "What happens to you when you drink? What happens to you when you try to quit?" I remember the last obsession that I had to drink for alcohol. Doc told me early on, he said, "Boy, you ask for help in the morning, you give thanks at night, and you don't miss that ever." And I can remember, for some reason or another, I picked this window in this apartment as the place for me to pray. It was, I don't know why, but I'd go to that window and I'd ask for help in the morning, and I'd go back to that window at night, and I'd give thanks for another day of sobriety. And if I'd forget it, I'd get out of bed and I'd go back down there and I'd go to that window. When I first started that, I was embarrassed. There was nobody there. And I'd look around. I didn't want anybody to catch me praying. Now, I didn't mind walking around town with wet pants and puke, you know. But don't catch me praying, you know. But I did that. And for some reason or another, I was willing to do that, and I did that religiously. And I was on my way to a meeting on a Wednesday night. I drove by a convenience store, and there was a bunch of construction guys standing out behind a pickup, and they were opening beers, and it blowing out of there. And it was on me, just on me right there. And I went on to the meeting. And I was embarrassed, and I was ashamed that I was thinking about drinking, and I didn't tell anybody. And it was about a week later, and I told Doc what had happened that Wednesday night, and he said, "Do you think prayer helped you not drink?" And I said, "No. I came on down to the AA meeting. That's what helped." And he said, "Joe, before you started praying, what happened when you thought about drinking?" And I said, "Well, I drank." And right there, I got a little bit suspicious about this God business, you know, just a little suspicious. You know, he took me through the steps, and my God, what a tremendous amount of amends. I was truly a tornado running through lives, obviously. And we made these lists, and we started through this process, and I took a 5th step, and, you know, I had that amends list, and I started down through the amends, and I got through all those things, and I pretty much was done with my. And we were busy. We were doing 12-step calls at a different time. We called on people in the home, but on this list was an old judge, and he was just not a good guy. He treated me unfairly. We actually met in a beer joint in Oklahoma City and almost got in a fight. And I knew I was in trouble because I went to court regularly. And every time I walked in, he'd just bring the hammer down and I'd pay him a fine. He wouldn't even listen to my story. But he was on my men's list. And my sponsor told me to go see all the doctors. At that time, we only had a handful of doctors in our little town. And so I took big books to the individual doctors and told them about Alcoholics Anonymous and told them that we were willing to cooperate and help with any way we could with somebody who had a problem with alcohol. And so I got that done, and he said, "Joe," he said, went down there one day, and he said, "You need to go down to the court and take that judge a book and tell him about our meetings in Alcoholics Anonymous. And boy, I didn't want to do that. I had the guy on the list, but it was way down there. There was no hurry. So I went down there and I talked to that guy, and I found out right away quick that this guy truly cared about human beings. He loved his community. He loved the people in the community, and he would do anything to help somebody. And I talked to him about sending us people from the courts, and we started working together, and we started developing a relationship. And he came down with a crippling illness and had to step down from the bench and quit his practice, and we began to kind of just kind of hang out together, and we got into business together. And he wasn't able to do things, but he had the finances to do things. So the two of us came together and we started a business. And because of that amend and because of that relationship with that man, my future is secured. Tremendous turn of events. A guy that I hated, I despised. Our book talks about that we find it much more beneficial to make amends to an enemy than a friend. And I don't think they're talking about the material, but it just so happened this thing did work out. I got a divorce 10 years sober. I'd bought a little service station, and at one of my customers was a lady whose daughter I'd had some dealings with early on. I made amends to her. She became a customer and a friend. She was a doctor, and we started visiting back and forth, and I went through this divorce. And about the same time, Cheryl was living in Texas. Her husband died from alcohol and drug addiction. Things got real bad for me. I was 10 years sober. I was in trouble with the IRS. I was in trouble financially. I was working with a lot of people, and I think that's the only thing that saved me through this time. I made a tremendous amount of decisions based on self that had put me in the position I was in. And I moved in with my sister, and I couldn't sleep. I just absolutely could not sleep, just like I was brand new, and my mind just raced uncontrollably. And I remember about the third night that I was there, I had to have some rest. I was worn completely out. And I've never been a guy that prayed much on his knees, but that night I got out of that little bed and I got on my knees next to that bed, and I said, God, I feel that I've put, some restraints or something on our relationship. I'm now willing that you have all of me, good and bad. And from that night to last night, I've never missed a night's sleep. Things changed dramatically. I started dating the girl from Texas. We started having this cross-the-country relationship, I guess you'd call it. And she told me she'd moved to Oklahoma if I could find her a job, and she was an accountant. So happened that I sponsored a guy that worked for an insurance company, and he was over the accounting, and I called Ken, and I said, Ken, I've got a gal you need to hire. And he said, okay, boss. And he gave Cheryl a job that afternoon, and she moved up from Texas, and we stepped this relationship up a little bit, and we were trying to do things a little bit different. And she called me one day at work. She said, tonight after the meeting, I want to go out and eat, and I have some things I need to discuss with you. And she had 3 children. And I thought, she's met somebody else. She's going to dump me. All that stuff goes through her head. And after the meeting, we went out to eat, and she said, there's a couple of things. One thing in particular that you've got to know and you've got to understand, and I have no idea how this is going to work out, but I can't live with this any longer. I've got to talk to you about it. And I said, well, honey, what is it? Her oldest boy's name was Eric. And she said, Joe, Eric is your son. And I said, well, how's that work? And she said, when I left Edmond with Will, unbeknownst to me, that I was pregnant with your son, and Eric is your son. And it was quite at first it was a fear thing, and then it just kind of took me back to that night that I absolutely, I believed, did a third step, maybe for the first time when I was 10 years sober, that things were falling into place. And so we got married, and I got to raise a son that I didn't know I had. He's been trying to do this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous since 1997, and this date has not been that successful. He gave me my first granddaughter, a little girl that has reached a part in me that I didn't know existed. And one of the things that I've had her an awful lot. Eric and Jill got a divorce early on, and so when she was about 2. So I've had her an awful lot, and I've had to come to know what it is to have unconditional love with no fear of what might happen. I was laying in bed with this little girl watching cartoons with her gathered up on my shoulder. And she looked up at me and she says, "Papa, you're my best friend." I didn't deserve that. This very last weekend, this past weekend, she came to stay with us for the weekend. And she says, "Papa, I need to talk to you." And she was totally and absolutely confused about who's who in her family. If Daddy is my daddy and your daddy's daddy, why is my name this and your name's that? And I took the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I got down to the inventory portion, and I laid that out to that 13-year-old girl, and I feel beyond a shadow of doubt that she understands totally. I accepted complete and total responsibility for what had happened. And I told her how ongoing life is, and how when we make decisions that it may be the rest of our lives of owning up, fessing up to the life run on self-will, run right. I told her how selfish and inconsiderate I'd been. And I told her of how decision-making, how important that is, and how far-reaching that is. As a 13-year-old girl, I think she understood totally. I was going to a meeting one night, and she was in the car with me, and we went and picked up a newcomer. And Bobby comes and gets in the car, and she says, "Hi, Bobby, I'm Katie. How much time you got?" He said, 3 days. She said, "I got 5 years." We're driving down the road one day, and she's sitting over, and I can see her little mind's really whizzing and going, and I said, "What's going on?" She said, her stepdad's in AA, and she sits out in the foyer of this another group, and she said, "Papa," she says, does the Lord's Prayer end with amen or keep coming back?" Like you, I thought that was pretty humorous, but think about what we've done to what I believe is the perfect prayer. The absolute perfect prayer. What we do in Alcoholics Anonymous is observed by lots of people. I think we need to be cautious of that. I've certainly enjoyed my weekend here. I couldn't agree more with Bob's talk on the traditions, the fact that if Alcoholics Anonymous is going to be here for Katie and her kids and what have you, it'll be through strong sponsorship, home group, commitment to that home group, and a basic knowledge of the traditions for each and every one of us, so that we can preserve this thing and guarantee that it'll be here for those to come. I think we're charged with that. I'm a guy that's been here for 35 years and made a tremendous amount of mistakes that have impacted Alcoholics Anonymous, at least in my community. And I'm doing my utmost, one day at a time, to make that right. I think I owe that to old Doc, to Otto, and certainly my new sponsor, Tom. I thank you for putting up with me. It's been a great weekend. I'm looking forward to hearing Beth and Bob and heard Larry last night. Great deal. Sandy, this will be a great weekend. More importantly, I think it's an opportunity to come together. Shared experiences is probably one of our most precious possessions. Get with somebody, meet them, share from the heart. Thank you so much.